Amir Gilutz from B'Tselem and Misana Morani from Adalah. So I'm doing this conference, well, FFIPP Bordeaux is doing this conference with FFIPP Spain. So I'm letting Raquel, if she wants to present a bit the organization. If not, Apolline, I'll let you do it.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Do you hear me? Okay. Sorry, I disconnected the camera to make it easier. Okay, well, FFIPP Bordeaux and FFIPP Spain have worked on this conference. We both are part of FFIPP Europe, and our first aim is to raise awareness about the situation in Palestine and Israel. And we thought it would be really interesting to have this conference about Bedouins, and we were really lucky. And we want to thank both of you, because we were able to have today B'Tselem and Adalah, two different organizations that work with Bedouins. And we want to thank all of you for coming to this conference we've been working on.
Thank you so much. So about the conference, it will be around an hour with the two speakers speaking, and then 30 minutes for the questions. So you can ask them directly in the chat, or keep them later and ask them live to the speakers, as you want. You can also write them, and we will read them. It's a very free way of doing it. So first, you guys have 1 minute to tell us about yourself and your organization really quickly. So Miss Sana, if you want to start.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Misana Morani. I am the coordinator of the Land and Planning Unit at Adalah. Adalah, the legal center for the rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's clear from the name, we are a legal center that work to defend the human rights of the Palestinian people inside Israel and also in the OPT. Oops. Okay. Should I speak to start to speak more about the Bedouin as we see in the slides, or to wait? Okay. So one major part of our work is with the Bedouin community in the Negev, in the Naqab. The Naqab is the southern part. Here you can see it in the map in red. It's the southern part of Israel-Palestine. Before in 1948, before the Nakba, there was almost 90,000 Palestinian Bedouins living in the area of Bir al-Saba, Beersheba, and the Naqab area. 90% of them were expelled during the Nakba, some of them to Gaza Strip or to the West Bank, to Jordan, and to Sinai in Egypt. The rest of them, the 11,000 people who remained in the Naqab area, were concentrated in an area named the Siyaj area. I'll show you in a minute in the other map. And they were under a military regime like all the other Palestinians who stayed inside the borders of Israel. They were under a military regime for 20 years. Till 1966. During this time of the military regime, actually, the people were not allowed to move, and they were concentrated in the Siyaj area, and they were prevented from going back to their lands. This is the situation. But at the same time, Israel concentrated them in this area, but didn't allow them to develop their villages and homes and towns in a legal or in a recognized way. But anyway, the people have built their villages. Some of them were even lived there before the Nakba. Others were expelled during the Nakba and built their villages. And the situation is that, and Israel refused to recognize any of these villages. We're nowadays speaking about 35 unrecognized villages that Israel till today refuse to recognize. So the Israel deals with see the Bedouins as nomads. It's so much. It's part of the Zionist narrative. It's so. It's a strong part of the narrative Zionist is that the land of in general was empty, but also the land of Naqab was empty, and the people are just nomads that they can today live in the Negev, in the Naqab. Tomorrow they will move to Egypt, and we can, and this way Israel is still dealing with the Bedouin as nomads that the state can move them around and put them whenever the state like. And taking this into consideration, and also taking into consideration the Zionist ideology of taking over the land, the policy of Israel towards the Bedouin from 1948 till today is a policy of forced urbanization and forced displacement. This means that the plan of Israel, starting from the 70s, is to build townships, to move the Bedouins, to concentrate the Bedouins in these townships. And as for today, we have 7 townships like that. And almost half of the Bedouins already live in these townships after they were forcibly moved there. The other half are still living in the unrecognized villages. And if you can move to the other slide to show you the unrecognized villages. Yes, so this is the map of the Naqab area. If you see, there is a black line in the middle of the map, an interrupted line that is it's a sign for the siege area where all the Bedouins were concentrated. This is the part of the Naqab that we're speaking about. And in this siege area, we have the 7 townships, another 10 villages that were recognized, and the 35 villages that are not recognized till today. Later I will speak more about what does it mean to live in unrecognized villages, and what are the policies that are still practiced on the people.
So I think we have one interesting question from Karine Lenoir. We said we would keep the question for the end, but I think it's very important to understand all the conference. She's asking, what is the Nakba? So if you want maybe to say a few words about it, Ms. Sana.
Sure. The Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. It's the term used to describe the events that started in 1948, a little bit before, that led to the establishment of Israel and the demolishing many of the Palestinian villages and towns, and expelling many of the people out of the borders of Israel, or even to the refugee camps all around, and also in the internal displaced people. So it's a term that we use to describe these events, but also as a event that it's an ongoing events that we it's not like it's an event that started and ended in the 1948, but it's an ongoing event that is a result of different policy that are continuing till today, especially in Naqab. We can see that clearly.
Thank you, Ms. Sana. Amir, can you tell us a bit more about B'Tselem and how you are focusing on Bedouin, but also all Palestinian community in the occupied Palestinian territories?
Sure. So B'Tselem is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. We've been established more than 30 years ago, sadly, and sadly because we would have been very happy to not exist at this point, but unfortunately, this prolonged occupation is continuing. And so is our mission of documenting developments on the ground, human rights violations, do research into specific incidents such as the killings or beating or looting of Palestinians, by Israeli security forces, by settlers, and we write reports where we look at a particular subject kind of more in depth. And in the last several years, we've invested a lot of our research capacity and effort to show how all existing Israeli state mechanisms don't provide any form of accountability. So they don't really provide any real defense for Palestinians. And I think we'll get to speak to that with regards to the Bedouins and home demolitions a bit later. Just a couple more words about B'Tselem generally. We call for an end of the occupation. We're not invested in one or another particular solution, but we don't see a future that is based on freedom and equality and human rights for all people who live here if the occupation itself doesn't end. I mean, it's quite simple. And in spite of being an Israeli organization, or rather as an Israeli organization, we call on the international community to apply effective pressure on Israel to change its policies and to bring an end to the occupation, because we don't really see any other non-violent path forward out of this reality that we currently live in. So this is just briefly about B'Tselem, and I invite, of course, everyone to go on our website. We have lots of documentations and videos and a lot of information and maps available on the website. With regards to the Palestinian communities we work with in Area C, I'll talk about, I'll give you a little bit of very general background and then talk about the Palestinian communities and the Israeli policies that they suffer from. So very, very broadly, what Israel aspires to do and kind of the principles that are at the foundation of most Israeli policies that we're going to discuss today is how do we take over as much land and resources as possible. That is one principle. And the second principle, with as few Palestinians on those lands as possible. So how do we clear Palestinian communities out of the way as effectively as we can to set facts on the ground, expand the the settlement enterprise, and use the resources for our own interests. So essentially, the occupation, which began in 1967, the occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, those territories that before that were not controlled by Israel, you can describe it as this systematic process of taking over the means of livelihood from the hands of one people and transferring them to the hands of another people. It is done through a scheme of divide and rule. So in 67, when these territories were occupied, all of the people, all of the Palestinians living on them had the same legal status. And they could also, in the first years of the occupation, actually move freely into Israel, between Gaza and East Jerusalem, and so on. But very deliberately and slowly and over time, Israel created these distinct realities and categories to fragment Palestinian society and to fragment Palestinian space. And largely speaking, these three categories are those of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem, which was annexed immediately after the war. So according to Israeli law, it's actually considered Israeli territory, even officially, and the Gaza Strip. And now if we move to focus on the West Bank, which is the territory that we're going to discuss in greater detail today, there are further efforts to fragment the West Bank. So it's not that the West Bank itself is a cohesive territory, but rather Israel moved 400,000 settlers, meanwhile, its own people, completely against international law, into around 250 settlements into the West Bank. And meanwhile, the majority of the Palestinian population is concentrated on these enclaves, these little islands of land that are disconnected from one another and are disconnected from the resources that they need in order to thrive. And those are actually areas A and B. What has been during the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s the areas that were declared as areas A and B. And I want to clarify a little bit more what that means before we zoom in on area C finally. So I'm kind of like giving you the the broad perspective, and then we'll discuss area C because it's very important to understand the meaning of this. During the mid-90s, during the Oslo Accords, when this division was made to areas A, B, and C, first of all, it was supposed to be temporary. So the idea was that it would be a gradual process that would lead to a future Palestinian state. More authority, more power will be gradually given to Palestinians to self-govern, right? To have a state. Instead, and this, again, this was the division itself was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to last 5 years. Here we are 25 years later, and instead this division became a way for Israel to make the occupation even more entrenched and its control of the population more efficient. The other thing to say about this, this division is when it was done, the logic behind it was demographic. So, and not geographic, right? So it's not that area A, for example, is the north and B is the middle and C is the south. No, area A is the urban centers. Area A is the areas that are most packed with Palestinians, and vice versa. So area C is the most rural area, the most open space, the least populated. Why is this important? Because that is exactly what Israel wants, right? If we remember those basic principles, we want the land, we don't want the people who live on it. So essentially all Israeli settlements are in area C, in the West Bank, I should say, not including East Jerusalem. And that is, area C is 60% of the West Bank, so it's the larger of the three categories by far. And it is the area that has almost all of the development potential of the entire West Bank. So all of the open space, the fertile land where agriculture can be developed, and tourism and industry and housing and more towns, more cities, that is all in area C. And that is exactly why Israel wants to get under its control. Unlike Tulkarem, Kalkilia, Ramallah, we don't want responsibility for the well-being of the people, of the Palestinians who live there. Okay, so this is the background. And now I'll just say maybe that, in area C, even though it's the least populated, there are Palestinian communities that live there. There's anything between 200 to 300,000 Palestinians living in area C. We don't have an exact figure of that. I think nobody does. But there are dozens of shepherding and farming communities that their situation maybe is similar to the situation that Maisana will speak about with the Bedouins in the Negev. But I just want to say that I'm not actually speaking about Bedouins as a category per se, because some of these communities are farming communities that, culturally, historically, they're not actually Bedouins, but the Israeli policies that are inflicted on them, that are imposed on them, are the same ones as the ones that are inflicting Bedouins that live in area C. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. So you're talking about Israel wanting the land and not the people. Ms. Sana, do you see the same phenomenon in the Negev? Israel wants the land and not the people, I guess, and how does it affect the communities there?
So yeah, basically this is the main aim of all the policies that Israel is implementing in the Naqab area. So this is the whole idea of concentrating the Bedouin communities within the townships is being done under the name of it's not clear, it's not said like that, it's said that it's in the name of bringing modernity, modern life style to the people and giving them service, which is also a bad narrative and a bad target, but also the real target of the Israeli policies is to concentrate the people and take over their lands. It's being done in two different ways. The first way is, as I said, in concentrating them and move them from their lands to these townships. It's either done directly by the home demolishing or eviction orders and other tools that are direct tools, or it's done indirectly by creating a coercive environment that make the living of the people in their villages and towns, villages impossible. It's mean that there is no adequate access to water, no adequate access to electricity, to other services like healthcare, like schools, a lot of law enforcement practices that are really violent, one with a lot of police forces coming to the village, all the villages all the time, giving order demolishing and high fines for everyone that the state is willing to move them, forcibly displace them. And the other tool that is used to take over the land is actually a legal one that just doesn't recognize the rights of the Bedouin communities over their own lands. So that the legal system, the legal laws and the legal definitions is made in such a way that Bedouins can't actually prove that they are the owners of their own lands, even if they are sitting in these lands and it's their historical lands for many years. When Israel started the registration of the lands, all the Bedouin people, communities have submitted their claims about their lands, and actually each tribe and each person have specified their own land. But the state of Israel also claimed that this is an empty land that doesn't belong to anyone legally, and thus have in contra claims and saying that all the Naqab area is an empty area according to the Ottomans laws, and as an empty area, it should be registered under the state of the name. Under the name of the state. And by this, for the state of Israel, all the Bedouins are trespassers, and thus should be evicted and have no rights, neither on their lands or they have no rights to stay in their villages, and thus the villages are unrecognized and illegal. So this is the main ideology behind the whole attitude that the state of Israel is implementing on the Palestinian, in the Bedouins in the Naqab area. And we see different tools starting from laws like the Pravar Plan bill that was supposed to solve the problem of the unrecognized villages at once with a law that will evict everyone and move them to the recognized villages and townships. It's happening through different lawsuits that specify specific communities, not everyone, but a specific community like al-Hiran case, for example, where the state have submitted an eviction orders and demolition orders against the people of al-Hiran, and eventually the Supreme Court allowed their eviction from the land that they are living there from the 50s. Although we in the court proved that they are, even according to the Israeli definition, they are not trespassers. But they were moved there under the military regime with a direct order from the military. It still wasn't enough for the state of Israel to recognize any right of the people to stay in the village. For them, they are trespassers and nomads, so we can just move them from Hura, al-Hiran, or Hura, the township, the close township. It's not an issue for the legal regime. And lately we're seeing more even an increase in the use of eviction orders and tools against specific people. So it's not, if the state of Israel and the Pravar Plan aim to against the whole 35 unrecognized villages, and there was a lot of mobilization against this plan that actually froze it. So they now, after that, moved to a more specific action. So it's not the whole 35 villages. We'll go to village per village for Hiram, for example. After that, we're seeing that it's not even the whole village, because and the state is going against specific families in each village. And by this way, if targeting a specific person with demolition orders, you're clearly making the whole community terrified, and it's much harder to make the people stand against such activists, because they are also afraid that they are coming next. So it's different tools that are actually leading to the same policy of forced displacement and forced urbanization as well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sana. Amit, do you want to react on it? Do you see the same pattern of the Israeli government using terror and specifying people in order to make everyone leave or go where the state wants? Do you see this in the West Bank?
So in the West Bank, for the most part, Israel uses the quiet kind of war of attrition tactic, which is creating this coerced life environment, meaning it makes life as miserable and unbearable for these communities as it possibly can, hiding behind a veil of law enforcement in order for them to leave, to give up and leave, as if by their own choice. Now, it's important to know that according to international law, if these people leave because you created a coercive life environment, you made life impossible for them so that they can't stay where they're at, that's still a forcible transfer, which is a war crime, right? You don't actually have to take people and put them on trucks and dump them somewhere else where you want them to be in order for it to be a forcible transfer. The reason Israel avoids doing that, for the most part, it's not that it hasn't done that at all, the West Bank, it has in the past, but it's rare, is because it doesn't want to arouse too much international attention and perhaps pressures. This whole operation of taking the means of livelihood from one people and transferring them to the hands of another has to happen while denying the human rights of these 5 million people. They live under military law, under a separate legal system. They don't enjoy political rights. They can't really participate in any meaningful way in a decision-making mechanism about their own lives. How do you do all of that while still successfully portray yourself as a democracy and enjoy all the perks that come with being a member in that club of states, of democracies? So that's, that is kind of one of the overarching logics of how Israel operates. And with regards to these communities, it's much more efficient, even though it might require patience from an Israeli perspective, to conduct this war of attrition against these communities, creating a coercive life environment so that they leave, rather than just taking them by force and putting them somewhere else. So now I actually want to go in a bit of a greater detail, showing 3 facets of what we mean when we say a coercive life environment in the West Bank. So one has to do with the Planning and Building Authority. The second is settler violence. And the third is military training. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So with regards to planning and building, Israel, for the settlements, Israel allocates a lot of resources, creates outline plans that are very generous, that include public spaces and an extra space for the settlement to develop into in the future. And the exact opposite of that is how it operates with regards to Palestinians in Area C. So because under the Oslo Accord, this division of the West Bank that we discussed earlier, Israel retains the planning and building authority in Area C, right? Because it is in charge also of civil matters. I didn't actually go into that earlier, but part of what this division means is that Israel gets to control all civil matters, even in Area C. So it has, you know, if a Palestinian wants to build anything, they need to apply for a permit and get it from Israel, more specifically from the Israeli military, which is the sovereign power in the occupied territories. This is true for all of Area C, which again is 60% of the West Bank. It's the majority of the West Bank. And Israel made it all but illegal for Palestinians to build anything in Area C. So they can apply for permits, but they're not going to get it. They're not going to get the permits approved, right? There's a chance of between 4% and 2%, depending on the year, according to the civil administration's own data, that a permit would be approved, which means that there's between 96 and 98% that the permit would be denied, right? And it's expensive and it's laborsome and, you know, it takes an effort. So these people can't build anything. This is true for residential structures. It's true for public structures, you know, for clinics, for schools. If you lay a pipe running water from your families, you know, traditionally your family's spring, running water from a spring to your field or to your community, the civil administration will come and cut that pipe. We just saw that last week with the civil administration cutting a pipe leading water to 2 communities in the South Hebron Hills. This is not rare. If you get a donation of solar panels, for example, from a humanitarian organization or a state, the civil administration can come and confiscate that equipment. And I didn't say this before, but just to be clear, you know, because these communities are kind of comparable to unrecognized, I would say it's kind of a different legal system because it's an occupied territory, but essentially the civil administration doesn't approve an outline plan for these communities. When you don't have an approved outline plan, you know, any building is illegal. You're also not connected to the water pipes. You're not connected to the electricity grid. Again, in spite of all the settlements around you being very generously provided all of these resources, you don't get those. But you know, when you lead water to your community one way or another, the military often will interfere and actually prevent you from doing that. So this is really this war of attrition of making life as impossible as Israel can while hiding behind this cloak of law enforcement. Now this year, in spite of Corona, in spite of this unprecedented health and financial crisis all over the world and here as well, we've actually seen a spike in home demolitions. So Israel actually turned more Palestinians homeless this year in the West Bank than in the last 4 years. So since 2016, which was a peak year. So this is the first and very, very substantial and very, very important tool that Israel uses to create this coercive life environment. And I'll talk very briefly about the 2 others. Settler violence is violence, obviously, that's conducted by settlers. It's often physical attacks on property. It can be anything from killing, which is more rare but does happen, to theft of olives, or right now we're in the olive harvest season, so there are many of these incidents, cutting down of trees, houses being attacked, and so on and so forth. It is carried out by settlers, but it is fully backed by the state, because soldiers are often there and they do nothing to protect Palestinians. Sometimes they will even take part in the attacks themselves. And then that violence continues with a complete lack of enforcement, the complete lack of law enforcement, lack of accountability against the perpetrators. So the state turns a blind eye fully towards this violence because it actually promotes its own interests. So settler violence, in a way, is like an unofficial privatized arm of the state, pushing away Palestinians, shepherds from one grazing land or a farmer from another field, and is actually at the forefront of this process of of pushing Palestinians away from their land. And then the last of these is military trainings. Those are actually more specific to the communities that are based in the northern Jordan Valley, where the Israeli military since 2013 began training between people's homes. What usually happens is that the military will issue an eviction order, a temporary eviction order, and then these people will have to leave their own homes and go somewhere else for a few hours usually. But the military will conduct its training right between their houses, sometimes ruining crops. And often the farming in these areas is based on rainfall. So if this comes in the wrong season, the whole year's produce can be lost this way when tanks go over your produce in the field. And then that is continued also by the military often not cleaning after it leaves properly, leaving all kinds of ammunition behind, which is simply dangerous, and people get injured and sometimes even killed because of this. So these are the three elements of the coercive life environment that is inflicted on these Palestinians: the planning and building, which is simply illegal for them, the violence of the settler pushing them away field by field, and the military training. And I think now, Alex, would be a good time to show that short video that kind of puts some visual images to everything that I just discussed.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. We're working on it on the video right now.
If it's possible to get it with the sound, that would be better.
I think you have to activate your microphone, Alex. Sorry, this would be much easier to do in face-to-face, but Zoom is working. Well, thank you,
Alex.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for this video by B'Tselem, who shows really well, who sums up very well what you were saying about all the ways Israel is making life unbearable for communities, not only Bedouins, but farming and communities over there in the West Bank. So the next question will be for Ms. Sana. How is it to live in a township in the Negev right now? Like, is it the same issue as in the West Bank that Amit was saying for access to public structure, schools, electricity, water? What are the main issues that these communities are facing there?
So basically, yes, to live in an unrecognized village is really similar to what Amit described. Basically, the unrecognized villages are not connected in an adequate way to any of the services, not to water, not to electricity. And the people usually use solar panels to put solar panels on the top of their homes to get electricity, and they have their own pipes that the people put for long distance from the connection that the state allowed, which is a few kilometers out of the village, and they have pipes. Small pipes that the people put in order to get water, and they pay high prices for this water, much more than any other citizen of the state. The same goes as for schools and healthcare and other services. In some of the unrecognized villages, there are it's called services. Buildings. It's not buildings even. It's more a bunch of caravans that people, students go to school. That is used as school, as kindergartens, or as clinics, but they function in a very poor conditions. And nowadays, with the corona and all learning from distance, you can imagine that. This just means that the students and the kids in the unrecognized villages don't have any access to these in distance learning. So this is the situation in general in the unrecognized villages is in a poor conditions, but the corona nowadays they show it much more. Also the gap and make the conditions even worse in the unrecognized villages. Also, also the newly recognized villages, as I mentioned, that there were 10 villages that were recognized by the State of Israel in 2004 or 5. It's almost 2 decades ago. But also these villages are still suffering from very poor conditions and not really different from the situation in the unrecognized villages. So also this recognition doesn't mean a lot. Meanwhile, if I take the case of Hiram, for example, the people were there facing the demolition orders and the evictions and didn't get any services by the state. And just to mention that they were the idea behind their eviction was to build a Jewish town in the name of Hiran instead of them. Next to Hiran, there was an outpost of settlers that actually are related to the settlers in Hebron Hills that came into the woods next to Hiran village, and they lived there in caravans that were supplied by, with electricity and water and all the services by the state. And it's just so clear that also this is the situation in different, it's called individual farms, that the State of Israel allocate a huge land to some specific Jewish families that to have their own farms, and they will get all the services that is needed. But for the unrecognized villages, these services are not given, and it's a matter of policy. It's a matter of creating this coercive environment in order to make the people move to the recognized villages or townships that the state planned for them. And as for planning, I also want to relate a little bit with what Amit said about the planning system. That also planning make a major factor of displacing people unrecognized village doesn't even exist on the plans, on the maps of the planning system. So if there is and it's happening a lot in the Naqab in the past few years, if there is any project, an expansion of Road 6, the major highway in Israel towards Eilat, for example, it will just go through and on top of 10 unrecognized villages without even mentioning or giving any sign that there are unrecognized villages there or that people live there. It's the same for military zones. It's the same for a phosphate mine can be built under, as in this specific case, it was built even actually under a village that is recognized, but it will still mean that the people will get evicted and transferred in order to continue this project. And so the planning system also plays a huge role in so-called the development of the Naqab that is done on top of the unrecognized villages and for the benefit of the Jewish people that live in the Naqab or that the state is planning to bring there.
Yeah, thank you. We hear sometimes the Israeli state saying it's too difficult to give water, electricity to small villages around the Negev, which is a desert. But as you say, for Israeli farmers that settle here, it's very easy for the state to do. So, as you said, it's not a matter of doing it; it's a matter of policy. So this reminds us a bit about David and Goliath, like Goliath being the Israeli state, very powerful, having all the tools and doing so the international community don't really have images to put on the media or everything to defend these communities. So what can you do? What is Adalah doing? What about like political representation? How do you fight these policies?
Yes. So we're trying.
Sorry, as well after.
So we're trying different tools. So, for example, our main tool is the legal tool to try to defend communities against their forced displacement. And for example, the people of Hiran, we represented in the courts for 14 years. Even eventually that the Supreme Court rejected our legal claims, but it's still we managed to get the people to stay in their homes and live in their village for 14 years. And we're trying to also with all objections to different master plans and trying to stop plans that are gonna actually lead to an eviction of different communities. At the same time, we try to demand all the services to give the people the services that will make their lives a little bit easier, as for schools, transportation for schools, and different and all the social economic rights to work towards giving the rights to the people. In addition to the legal avenue, we also work both on campaigning and raising awareness and mobilizing the community and the Palestinian citizen in general. And we also work on the international level with the different UN bodies, the EU, and the different embassies. But we had some achievement there on the level of narrative recommendations. And for example, the Brother Plan also had a lot of international pressure to stop this plan, also due to the different demonstration and the mobilization of the community itself. But many times we face the narrative that because the Bedouins in Al-Naqab are citizens of the state, so it's an internal issue. And many times the international community just refuse to intervene and have a clear stand with the rights of the people, as it will be understood as intervening in the sovereignty of the state of Israel. But we're still trying to raise these topics and raise awareness for the violation of the rights of the people.
Maybe I'll talk a bit about Khan al-Ahmar as an example of successful mobilization led by the community. And also it ties up, I think, both what Maisana and myself, kind of the territories that we are discussing, because the residents of Khan al-Ahmar are originally from the Nakab, they're from the Negev desert. And they were expelled by the Israeli military in the 50s and moved into the West Bank, which was then controlled by Jordan before the Israeli occupation, and settled in an area east of Jerusalem on privately owned land of Palestinians from Anata. They reached an agreement to use their land. And after the occupation began in '67, they started being pressured by Israeli authorities in many different ways. In Khan al-Ahmar, we are talking about Bedouins per se. So, traditionally a shepherding community that needs access to grazing lands for the animals and so on. So with the erections of settlements on both sides of where they are at, both Kfar Adumim and Ma'ale Adumim, and the nature reserve that was declared, the military zones that were declared, that were kind of gradually pushed into this impoverishment, into a financial decline. And this community became a hotspot in recent years, with the Israeli government wanting to completely demolish the entire community, including a school that serves 200 children from that community and other communities around it, because it has a very, very strategic location. I won't get into the details right now. It's not that important for the point. But the point is that the Israeli High Court of Justice gave a stamp of approval for this intent by the state to commit this war crime of actually demolishing the entire community. And in this case, not doing just the coercive life environment guidebook, but actually taking people. This was the fear back in 2018, actually take the people and take them to a different so-called relocation site, which denies their ability to live their way of life, which robs them, which again kind of pushes them towards impoverishment and criminalization, because there's no room for the animals there. There's no access to grazing land. And in the case of this specific relocation site, it's very, very close to a huge dumpster that was serving Jerusalem for many, many years. The soil there is toxic. That was one of the options that was given to them. Another option that was offered by the state is to move them next to a sewage treatment facility east of where they are at. So again, in the proximity to a hazardous site. The Supreme Court, accepted that, like we as B'Tselem, we don't know of a single case, okay, when a Palestinian plead against the demolition of their own homes in the West Bank, and the High Court of Justice accepted their plea. They always, at least in the West Bank, the end result is always just looking at a very, very narrow question of whether or not the building was built legally. And of course, it was built illegally because Israel dictates the law and makes it illegal for Palestinians to build. But they have to, like, people have to build. It's not a luxury to have a roof above your head, right? Certainly not in the desert and not anywhere. But in 2018, in the summer, it seemed like any minute now the plan was moving forward, and actually heavy vehicles came to the community for the first time to make some infrastructure, but the infrastructure was to facilitate the process of removing the residents. So some roads were kind of flattened, not for the benefit of the people, but in order to expel them more easily and efficiently. And there were hundreds of activists, again, led by the community, but hundreds of activists that slept in the community every night for weeks during that period of time. And somehow it was stopped. the plan didn't move forward. Actually, I visited Khan al-Ahmar just by coincidence earlier today. And the reason I was able to visit there, the reason the community still stands is because of effective international pressure. Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor at The Hague, issued a statement reminding Prime Minister Netanyahu that should this plan move forward, that could be considered a war crime, that he would have personal liability for. And perhaps there was, I mean, certainly there was a lot of international mobilization around this community. And perhaps there were some other things behind the scenes that we're not aware of. But the reason that Khan al-Ahmar stands is effective international pressure. Again, of course, led by the residents themselves in a very inspiring and you know, a very powerful example of what can be done, even facing this relentless occupation. You know, an entity that completely does not recognize not only your community but really your humanity, that does not value your life or your well-being, does not have your best interest anywhere in proximity to the decisions that are made. So this is about mobilization, and I guess now my son and I will take questions from the audience, right?
Yeah, this is question time. So thank you so much, guys. As I was saying, you guys can write it if you feel more comfortable, and I or Raquel will read them, or you can directly ask Miss Anna and Amit all of your questions, even the one that sounds silly, because there's no silly questions.
Okay. Yeah. Could you maybe talk to us a little more about political representations of the Bedouins, for example?
Okay, so this as political representation is more related to the Naqab area and not. So yeah, يعني the Bedouins have. Okay, let me reframe that. So, as citizens, the Bedouin community have the right to vote, and many of them vote, but there are huge obstacles in the way of voting as well, because of the unrecognized villages and the fact that there are no, the voting centers are located in a faraway places from the unrecognized villages. Many of the people are facing a lot of problems getting to the voting centers, and actually in the last two elections we tried to convince the election committee that there should be transportation by the state that will help the people get to the election center, to the voting centers, or otherwise to put the election the voting centers in some of the recognized villages, at least to make it easier for the people to vote. And this was rejected by the committee for different reasons, but we still the people there was also a kind of mobilization to help the people with private cars went to the Naqab to help people to go and vote. As for political representation, there is one MK Knesset member from the Bedouin community, MK Said Lakhroumi, and the different representatives of the community. It's either the heads of the localities of the townships, or the local committees in the unrecognized villages, with and then the regional council of the unrecognized villages, which is an NGO that يعني as for the Arabs, is the representatives of all the unrecognized villages, is a voluntary body. All of them are represented in the national political leadership bodies of the Palestinians in general, but it's not recognized by the state, but they are part of the leadership of the Palestinian people.
And maybe I will just add, just to be super clear, that for the Palestinians that live under the occupation, under military law, there is no political representation, right? They don't get to participate, they don't get to vote, they don't get to participate in any meaningful decision-making mechanism about their own lives. Even we talked about the Building and Planning Authority earlier. The committee that makes all these decisions is a committee of the Israeli military, where there is no representation of Palestinians. So it's just one example, but it's true for every aspect of life under occupation.
Yeah, thank you for this detail. That is obviously not a detail. So we have a few more questions. One from Sebastian, which is, what can be done? So it's a very broad question. I don't know, Sebastian, if you meant like, what can we do as French or Spanish people to help Bedouins from where we are, or what can be done inside Israel or inside Palestine? I'm not sure. So if not, Pablo, you had a question as well, if you want to.
Yes, but shall I ask the question and then, or go ahead? No.
You can ask a question, and if Sebastian wants to add more substance to his question, he can do it by writing. Thank you.
First of all, Amit, thank you, and Misana for giving us such an insightful hour about the Bedouin situation. My question is maybe a more personal question, because I'm very interested in the personal costs that people that work there, that criticize this situation, that talk about these situations, the personal cost you have to pay, or maybe you don't have to pay it, but maybe yes. So do you have to pay well, if you don't want to answer the question, you can avoid it, but do you have to pay a personal cost in your personal lives because of working with such sensible topics, and because of criticizing so deeply and so clear the situation there in Palestine and Israel? Thank you very much.
Maysana, do you want to begin?
You start.
Okay, thank you, Pablo, for the question. I mean, I grew up in the Negev, actually in Omer, very close to Tel Sheva. You know, it's exactly part of the story, but like on the other side, right? I'm an Israeli Jew. I'm part of the privileged part of society, and I think like many allies and activists on many different causes around the world, we try to use this privilege to amplify voices, to expose injustice, and to hopefully bring about a change. Of course, it's not easy to do this in Israel, within Israeli society, within Jewish Israeli society nowadays. I mean, there has been such a strong drift to very extreme versions of rights here, as well as in, you know, we see similar processes around the world, but certainly we see this here, and it does not make it easy. But of course, you know, the people who are actually paying the price for these policies are the people who these policies are actually inflicted upon. Like at the end of the day, I go back to my home. I have a shelter around, above my roof. I have running water and electricity and everything that and I'm safe. Like these are the important basic facts of life that Israel strips away from so many people around me. So I don't feel like I'm actually paying a substantial price. Like if there's some tensions around dinner table, yes, there are, sure, but every family has those around one issue or another.
Yeah, I relate very much to what Amit said. Eventually, me as well. We are privileged enough to go back to our homes and families without fearing that our homes will be demolished in each minute. But generally speaking, in Israel, and we can speak about two different aspects of rights that human rights defenders in general are paying. And one of them is related to the shrinking space for the work of the NGOs in general. It's either by different regulations that make it harder for the NGOs to get funding. It's either different political discourse that relate to the NGOs as betrayers or as people that should be that are illegitimate and should be fought. And it's and different regulations also that make that say that you have a law that make the NGOs clarify on different NGOs that to clarify their fund sources in all documentation and as if they're getting money from a foreign entity, including all the EU and the other funds. And also there are a lot of work by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs around the world to make to affect the different countries, specifically the European countries, to stop the funding of the NGOs or with different claims. Most of them are not correct or not or false accusations, saying that that the support of the people is actually claim to be as a support of terror or any other or anti-Semitism or any other tools used by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there's also white wings organizations that claim to be NGOs and spreading different claims against the real NGOs that are working with the communities and protecting their human their rights. On the other, in addition to that, usually the people that pays the prize are the human rights defenders from the communities itself. For example, in Naqab, the case of Al Araqib village, a village that was demolished by the state of Israel for more than 120 times. We even don't count anymore because it's happening on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, that the state goes and demolish the village over and over again. And also the state of Israel suited the Sheikh Sayah, one of the leaders of the main leader of the village, and his sons, asking for money for the expenses of the demolishing and the eviction of the village. So it's also not only putting and it's also led to putting him in jail for a period. So it's also so the human rights defenders from the community itself are paying much more, paying the price.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have another question. Do you want to read it? Sorry, I don't speak Spanish, Juanjo, or should I read it? Okay, I'm going to read it. So, hello. First of all, thank you for the great presentation from FFIPP Spain. I wanted to ask if there is any institution that helps the Bedouin community to support their traditions, their culture in Israel, And also, how is the situation in other countries in the area? Well, for Bedouins, I guess. So I guess for the first question, it would be for you, Miss Anna, about
Yeah.
in Israel.
There are different organizations working in the community itself, basically with the women in the community to support a more tradition, handcrafts and so on. But also, and I will take advantage of the question to say that the culture aspect is also a sword that can be used in two ways. For one side is to claim that it's a lifestyle that should be reserved and given and respected, but at the same time, the state of Israel, when this suits its policy, is using it against the community also. For example, in Emil Hiran case, when we said that the people don't want to move to live to Hura, so suddenly the state said, but all of your tribe is already in Hura, so you should move there. It's like, so it's this also this way of thinking about the traditions and is used by the state when it's useful for its policy against the population and its will. So it's not so. Yani also to keep in mind that when suddenly the state is interested in the tradition, it's sometimes not for the benefit of the people and their rights, but usually against them.
Yeah, I read something interesting. I don't remember where, saying that you have to be careful when you say we have to protect Bedouins and their human rights because of their tradition and lifestyle, because then you can put off people from these rights. For instance, other Palestinians who are maybe considered as less traditional from Western standards, but should as well have their human rights respected. So I don't know if Amit, you want to react on this, or if you see in the Israeli public this discourse or not? Not at all.
I mean, I wouldn't know to sort of give like a scientific answer about the Israeli public in this regard, but certainly human rights are, you know, it's in the word, right? They're undeniable for any human being. That's the idea. So certainly there's no hierarchy here, and there shouldn't be.
I would like to relate a little bit to that. Also, it's a debate that we usually hear about all the indigeneity of the people. Are the Bedouin indigenous people, or the Palestinians are indigenous people? And it's a legal frame that have its, from one side, because the way it's framed in the international law, it can be helpful for the people to get more rights, specifically on land issues. But from the other side, it's already include, as you said, assumptions as for the way that the people live or should continue to live. So if you're a Bedouin that want to work on hunting, you're already lost your traditional way of life, and you're already out of the category that the Western eyes imagined you. According to it, so it's also something that should be kept in mind, and it's a huge debate in the community itself, in the Palestinian community in general, and the Bedouin community, how to deal with this narrative and legal framework.
Thank you. Does anyone have any question? We have about 10 minutes left, so there's time for 1 or 2 questions. I think, Amit, you had a second video you wanted to show. Do you want to show it, or do you think it's not necessary now?
Sure, yeah, go ahead. So maybe I'll just say, this is a video we shot at Ras Atin, which is another Bedouin community. And a school was built there quite recently, a few months ago, because exactly of what Maisana was describing, you know, under Corona, children have an even harder time accessing education. And so the community built this school. It serves currently around 50 children. And the civil administration already came and confiscated equipment twice, I think in August, if I'm not mistaken. And soon the school might be under very imminent threat of demolition. And if Israel moves forward with this demolition, then these children, many of them would simply not have access to another school during this time of Corona. This is true even not in times of Corona, but even more so now. And it especially affects girls, actually, disproportionately, because boys are still allowed to travel further away from home to get to school than girls. So many of these girls, if the school is demolished, will simply stay at home.
And therefore have no access to education, I guess.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're going to watch a video. Alex is working on it. Should work from a second. Yeah.
يطلعوا عليه شايفه هذا الجبل كمان بمشوا ورا الجبل على يعني بعيد
أول بداية العام الدراسي في أول 9 وبدينا العام الدراسي فيها وهي يعني تقريبا تعتبر إنها غير مؤهلة مجرد صفوف من الطوب ومع ذلك بدينا فيها. كان كل يوم مستوطنين أو جيش أو الطيارة الزنانة تيجي تصور.
Since the Oslo Accord, Israel is trying to prevent any development of Palestinian Area C and usually not giving any permits. So actually forcing the community to build without a permit and preventing any facilities such as schools and education from the community.
ضمن ظروف صعبة جدا، هم بدهم يضطروا كل يوم على الأقدام ماشي، بعدين في عندك صيف وحر وفي عندك الشتاء وبرد وفي عندك خط سير سريع، في عندك يعني المستوطنين في الطريق، فالأهل بيضطروا إنه يعني الولد يمكن بس يكبر ويصير شاب يروح، بس البنت بتقعد في البيت لأنه بخافوا من الخطر عليها هي بالذات كونها بنت يعني. مجرد انهم اطفال حابين يتعلموا معهم لساتهم، لا هم معهم بارودي ولا هم معهم قنبله، بدهم يتعلموا بس. تخيلي صفين الطوب هذول من هون لهناك بده يمكن خطر على دوله اسرائيل. هي مش طالبين ترفيه ولا طالبين طيران ولا مطار ولا غيره، مدرسه نتعلم فيها يعني هذا ابسط الحقوق.
Well, sorry for the quality of the video. I think it's because of a Zoom delay. But thank you so much for sharing to us, Amit. And with your permission, we could maybe publish it on our Facebook page so people can watch it again, maybe in a better quality.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, perfect. We're going to
Sure.
do it now. We have time for one last question, if someone has one.
There was the question earlier about what can be done, so maybe I'll just quickly refer to that, and maybe Maisana would like to as well. And I will treat it as though the question was asked, what can be done from where we are sitting in Bordeaux or Spain?
Perfect, thank you.
So I think the first thing is like anything, it starts with educating yourself, learning more about the issue, attending webinars like this, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you for everyone who attended and took the time for this. And I think this is really important and fundamental. And then, at least from B'Tselem's perspective, with regards to the occupation, like I said earlier, we want to see effective international pressure on Israel. We cannot expect like the inertia of these processes that we've been describing here is very, very powerful, and it's not going to stop. Israel is not going to change course and suddenly treat Palestinians differently or reverse any of these processes by its own choice. We actually need international action. There needs to be a price to these inhumane policies by Israel. Now, what that means exactly for each of you, where you're at, I don't know. You work in your own communities. You work in a different political context than the one that I know. So you have to figure out for yourselves how you can push as civil society, as activists, as citizens in your countries. How can you push your representatives to have better stance on these issues? It really, really, really does matter. What the exact details of that is really up for you to pave that path and to discover.
I second what Amit just said, and he summarized it perfectly.
Well, thank you so much. And I think it's going to be the last question. It's from Justine. Is this issue discussed a lot in the Israeli society? So I think both of you can answer because both of you are within the society at the moment.
So as the Bedouin in the Negev, it depends. Yani there are some sectors in the Israeli community that are more aware about the situation in Naqab and the human rights violations. Others are more believe more the narrative that is put out there in the media by the state, that the Bedouins are trespassers, that they are criminals, that they are taking over the land, and so it's a little bit different. It depends on the different sectors and actually the political views and the ideology towards the situation. But this is one of the major things that the different NGOs are working on, raising awareness and showing that the violations of the and the human rights in general in Israel.
Yeah, this is something that we certainly aspire to. I do think there's a process of erasure of Palestinians from almost from public consciousness in Israel, but certainly from the media and from public discourse. There are very, very few points at which the Israeli public turns its glance towards Palestinians, and usually they have to do with violence or with some international conflict. So like Khan al-Ahmar, for example, the village that I talked about earlier with regards to international pressure became a hot media topic at the time, exactly because so many different parties were involved in this, and there was this power struggle between Israel and the international community, essentially. And to this day, there are some discussions around Khan al-Ahmar. There are these settler NGOs that are trying to push the government to move forward with the demolition and so on and so forth. So, but it's a very, very narrow perspective from which these issues are discussed. There's a lot of ignorance and denial, and unfortunately, quite a successful effort on part of Israel to restrict public discussion of these issues.
Well, thank you so much to both of you guys. I have to remind you guys that this event is also on Facebook Live, so you can watch it later. Misana or Amit, if you want to use it and publish it on your website or send it to anyone, of course, you're welcome to do it. And about getting information about Bedouins and every subject on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we also have an Instagram called FFIPP Bordeaux. I'm going to show it here. Of course, it's background, so it's just FFIPP Bordeaux. And we have a week which is only about Bedouin, post about Bedouin. And for instance, yesterday post was about Salah Ahmad-Din, which is a young Bedouin girl and won a literary prize called the Hans Christian Andersen Prize. So you can learn more about her life and about Bedouin living conditions on our Instagram as well. So from all FFIPP Bordeaux and Spain, I really want to thank you guys, Amit and Misana, for coming here. If you have anything more to say, that's your time. If not, I think we're going to end it right now.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this webinar. I also want to mention that I'm really happy that you choose to do the webinar with me and Amit and to speak both about the Bedouins in the Negev and Area SC. It's rare that we get the chance to speak about the two areas and the Bedouins in general, ignoring the green line. Usually the framework is that of Bedouins in Naqab, citizen of Israel, and the Bedouin in Area C as in the occupied territories, and usually people just look at the picture as two different situations that are not related. And as I think our talk today showed, that there is a lot of policies that are combined, crossing over the green line, and there is a lot of similarity in the situation and in the regime in general. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. We could see the similarities between these two situations. We're going to end here. Thank you so much for everyone who participated. You will find on our Facebook this conference, Facebook Live, and also we'll both of your website, guys. So everyone, I think they both have an English and an English translation, so you can both guys read what B'Tselem and Adalah are doing, because they're not only on Bedouins. And we're going also to publish Amit videos as well about B'Tselem videos. So thank you and have a good evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.